Welcome everyone to this author meets critics session for Joel and Mai's, I want to say new book, but it's about a year old now, 2020 book, None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the US and Canada. My name's Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm an assistant prof at the University of Waterloo in Sociology and Legal Studies here in Ontario. And I'll be chairing today's session, but Joel and I will start off with about a 15-minute presentation, kind of giving you a bit of an idea of what the book's about for those of you who haven't had the chance yet to read it. And then Laurie and Peter will each then go with their comments on the book for about 10 to 20 minutes each. And then Joel and I will take some time to respond afterwards, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, Joel, do you want to take it away?
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, everyone, for joining. And special thanks to Laurie and Peter for giving the time to both read our work and engage our work today. Looking forward to the conversation. About a decade ago, Sarah and I encountered one another's work on religious nuns in Canada, and we started talking about the potential for doing a book project like this, very much bringing together Sarah's work as a quantitative sociologist and my work as a qualitative sociologist, with a particular focus on Canada. And I'll say a bit more in a moment of how and why we landed on this comparative project. What we didn't fully anticipate then, though, certainly emerged was trying to write this book and then release it right as a pandemic emerged. So last April, the book came out. We had all these wonderful conversations planned for conferences last summer as the book came out. And of course, all of those have been deferred by a year. So probably not fantastic from a marketing and sales perspective, but we're delighted to have these conversations now a year later and looking forward to engaging this book. I did note that the plan was to actually look at Canada specifically. And we had launched this project. We were chatting with Phil Zuckerman, who was series editor for this project with New York University Press. And he was chatting with folks there, and they said, well, you know, if there's really going to be any uptake, you really need to talk about the United States. And so we had sort of this classic Canadian lament of, oh, yes, of course, with no disrespect intended to our friends in the United States. But I would honestly say, both of us would say that that actually animated our project in a number of ways that we didn't anticipate, that actually sharpened our ability, in our minds anyways, to understand what is taking place among religious nuns, not just in Canada, but in the US and different regions and so forth. And so that propelled us to these two central areas within the project, to really explore the dynamics of being a religious nun in contemporary North America. What does that look like? What are some of the experiences like? And how non-religious identity impacts other aspects of daily life. And we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And then to unpack the similarities and differences between religious nuns in Canada and the United States, and both within these different countries, but across country lines as well. So sort of a little bit of background for how we got into this particular project, and we'll go to the next slide, Sarah. This book was really prompted by a desire to explore a series of questions of what we thought were some gaps within the literature, and where we had some data available that would help us to lean into these. So first area, well, we knew that different types of disaffiliation as well as irreligious socialization played a role in the rise of religious nuns. And those who say they have no religion, we have little information about the biographic pathways into becoming a religious nun and how these are influenced by the surrounding social environment. And in our book, we really took the opportunity to develop a comprehensive model of factors that lead people to say that they have no religion. And central to our data and our theorizing and our argument is that social environment matters greatly. So when we compare regions, for example, across Canada or the United States, or between the two countries, you know, places where you have higher or lower rates of religious nuns, that actually makes a difference in how they view themselves, how they view the world around, and how they view different groups, religious and non-religious, within these different regions. Second, there was a need for a thorough model of macro demographic trends that affect the size of the religious nun population. And in this regard, while many authors assume that the religious nun population will continue to grow, we've also explored some of the countervailing forces, such as non-Western immigration and lower birth rates among religious nuns, and among other different variables that might actually slow or reverse the growth of religious nuns. And so we give some attention to that as well in our book. third. Works on spiritual and secular meaning systems very much existed within the United States, less so in Canada at the time of writing our book. And so we wanted to explore if differences existed in terms of how religious nuns in these two nations actually approach spiritual and secular meaning systems. And within that, to give attention to the diversity that exists within religious nuns. And as we've seen within this conference and others like this in recent years, diversity among religious nuns matters greatly in terms of sharpening our understanding of this group. Fourth, data in the United States revealed distinct sociopolitical attitudes and behaviors among religious nuns, and we wanted to explore how that compared to those in Canada, and might those beliefs and practices actually shift or change as religious nun population grows in different regions. And we've shown in our book that religious nuns are more left-leaning on a range of social issues, and that Canadians, both religious nuns and religious affiliates themselves, tend to be more left-leaning than those in the United States overall. And then finally, what attitudes exist among religious nuns, religious majorities, and religious minorities, and how do these attitudes affect group interaction? And we demonstrate in our text that religious nuns tend to hold more negative views towards religious groups that they believe to be are more exclusive in their beliefs and practices, whether Muslims or Catholics or evangelicals. And we talk a lot about the dynamics between atheists and evangelicals and their relative disdain for one another in both Canada and the US. And yet at the same time, religious nuns tend to have more positive views towards religious groups that they believe to be are more inclusive and tolerant of others, those like Buddhists, for example. All right, in terms of data and data source for this project, in terms of quantitative data, we drawn upon various high quality surveys between 1971 and 2017, including Canadian and American General Social Survey data, Canadian and American Election Studies data, and Pew Studies landscape study data, among others. And Sarah's happy to speak to those later on if there's questions there. And then in terms of qualitative data, also incorporate interview data with 30 religious nuns. Came about as part of a larger project that I've been part of, and some of you have read in the Meaning of Sunday. Took some of the data out of that project that didn't really deal with in the Meaning of Sunday, and incorporated that throughout this project as well. So we'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about some of the theoretical frameworks for approaching our project, some of the key findings.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Yeah, before I get to the theory, just some quick background data here to make sure we're all on the same page if you're less familiar with the US and Canadian context. So currently there's about a quarter of the Canadian American general populations that say they have no religious affiliation in recent national surveys. So it's this group that has no religious affiliation, the religious nuns of the NONE variety, that we use as a starting point for our study in the book. So these rates of non-affiliation have increased since especially the 1970s in Canada. Here in the graph, we see the trend in no religious affiliation for Canada in red since 1985, according to Statistics Canada's General Social Surveys. Canada had for a long time higher rates of religious non-affiliation than the US, but more recently, with a surge in non-affiliation since the 1990s in the United States, and a sort of plateauing of our rates here in Canada since 2010, the US has caught up to us so that we're actually quite similar now in our rates of non-affiliation. So even though the rate of religious non-affiliation is about just around 0.25% overall in both countries, there is still important regional variation across Canada and the US, right? So, we have a national rate, but it does vary quite a bit across the continent. So for example, in Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and the South US, rates of no religion are quite a bit lower. And then in the Canadian prairies, the Northwest Territories, and on the West Coast of both Canada and the US, the rates of non-affiliation are quite a bit higher. The rise in rates of religious non-affiliation are especially intergenerational. Right, so for example, here we see the breakdown of rates of no religion across 4 generations in Canada from 1985 to 2016. right? So whereas we see little variation within each of the silent and boomer generation in their rates of no religion since 1985, right? So if you look at the blue and yellow lines, they remain pretty flat over time for those two generations, even though the boomers are a bit higher than the silent generation. It's really when the Gen X and millennials arrive on the scene that we really see a strong increase in rates of no religion, to the point that now millennials in Canada, about a third say they have no religion. I didn't put the graph up for the US, but it's something similar for the US. In the US, you see a bit more of a time effect, right? So there is a bit more of an increase in no religion across the generations, but you also see this kind of, each successive generation has higher rates of no religion. And this is in the graph here. This is from General Social Survey data from Canada. So there are three central theoretical and conceptual frameworks that we're using in the book to help explain what we observe empirically with our qualitative and quantitative data. So those three kind of sets of theories are stages of decline theory, individualization and spiritualization theory, as well as polarization theory. I've got a quick summary here up on the slide for you. So beginning with the stages of decline framework, right, the surge of religious nuns over the last 50 years or so is understood by us in the book to be a consequence of longstanding generational religious decline over time, right? Practically, the stages of decline framework reveals that individuals initially diminish their level of religiosity by dropping their church attendance and religious group activities, along with various personal beliefs and practices, which over time coincides with and gives way to diminished social ties and reinforcements to one's religion. Over time, as fewer people behave or believe, the social pressure to belong to a religious tradition also wanes, and we begin to see the growth in those who say they have no religion. And as those who say they have no religion have children of their own, they are, across generations, more likely to raise their children without any religion. The second framework, so the individualization and spiritualization framework, it kind of contrasts the first to a certain extent, right? In contrast to the stages of decline framework, where researchers tend to focus on declining institutional expressions of religious affiliation, belief, and practice, some say that religion and spirituality are not necessarily declining, but rather changing, right? Many of you are aware of these big frameworks in our field. Rather than narrowly defining and measuring religion against conventional institutional markers, such as church attendance or communal-oriented religious activities, the individualization framework stresses ongoing private spirituality among individuals, a spiritual revolution, according to Heelis and Woodhead. Individuals would draw on a number of beliefs, rituals, and practices from a variety of sources, some of them linked to religious groups, some of them not, to build and maintain their own personalized faith system, according to this second framework. And then finally, we also engage with the polarization framework, so our third set of theories. In its broadest sense, polarization refers here to the widening gap between those who are actively religious and those who do not identify with any religion and score low on all or most religiosity scales, in a context where both groups are now substantial in size and must share the same social spaces. In a context of coexistence, there can be instances of what is called affective polarization, right? More hostile attitudes towards outgroups from certain religious groups towards certain non-religious groups, and vice versa. In contexts of more advanced secularization, where large groups of non-religious individuals coexist with remaining groups of more religious ones, there can also be instances of growing issue polarization, right? A widening gap in attitudes towards, say, abortion, gender roles, the environment, and government aid to the economically disadvantaged between the religious and non-religious, for example. Our main argument in the book is that all three of these perspectives are not necessarily contradictory, but operate instead in tandem with one another, with the caveat that a stages of decline explanation is the lead and most helpful one of the three. So stages of decline of organized religion, or also known as secular transition, right, opens up space for more individualized forms of spirituality to be held and expressed, which interest a substantial minority of individuals, but not necessarily all of them either. For example, we find amongst our religiously unaffiliated, there's usually between about a fifth and a third who kind of indicate interest in spiritual matters or take part in spiritual activities. So, an important phenomenon, but also not one that, touches everyone in society. There has not been a spiritual revolution in the sense that a majority of the religiously unaffiliated have adopted signs of less conventional spiritualities as far as we can measure them. This said, the spiritual but not religious phenomenon does exist, found in a substantial minority of religious nuns, and so is an important phenomenon that touches some in society. Finally, in North America, there's often a relatively peaceful coexistence between now large religious and non-religious groups in society. But this coexistence can at times lead to tensions and polarization in terms of how these two groups perceive one another, as well as in their attitudes and behavior. Although Laurie Beaman's deep equality may be the goal or ideal to strive for, in practice, some microsocial interactions between the religious and non-religious can be more antagonistic. Okay, I'll stop there. Joel and I go into each of these dimensions in more detail, in more both theoretical detail and especially empirical detail in the book. And hopefully we'll get to discuss some of them in more depth during the rest of the session. But for now, Laurie, I'll pass it over to you for your comments.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have written comments and I think I'll stick to those, given that I'm thinking about 2,000 things at once as we're in the midst of this conference. So the increase in those who self-describe as non-religious has been dramatic during the past few decades. Understanding this heterogeneous group has become a pressing issue for a range of reasons, including the formation of sound public policy, anticipating shifts in charitable giving and volunteering, and of course, for religious groups who seek to understand the reasons for the turn toward non-religion, and in some cases hope to lure people back. Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme bring their considerable talent in both quantitative and qualitative analysis to the project of understanding the non-religious in Canada and the United States. The overarching goal of None of the Above is to offer empirical data to better understand the potential social impact of non-religion. That's one of their goals. Drawing on survey data from Canada and the United States, as well as 30 in-depth interviews with non-religious people in Alberta and existing qualitative data, qualitative research in the United States, Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme offer a nuanced analysis using a range of theoretical tools. And Sarah's just gone over some of those, including a sophisticated engagement with a secularization thesis. An exploration of the stages of decline thesis as a descriptive tool is especially effective in their work and lends insight to the process of disaffiliation. And of course, as Sarah's already said, they also consider individualization and polarization, but the stages of decline is the lead theory, if you will. Importantly, Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme drill down into the complex and myriad forms of non-religion and its expression. They bring their data into conversation with theoretical contributions from other scholars, including Grace Davies' Believing Without Belonging thesis. Further, their comparative analysis with the United States highlights the similarities and differences between these two countries in relation to non-religion. Moreover, where data do not exist, Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme point the way for future research, identifying gaps in knowledge that are in urgent need of being addressed. They also bring their analytical expertise to the impact of survey question formulation on measures of affiliation. There's not much they don't do in this book. This critical approach is invaluable to those of us who want to understand religious and non-religious identification on surveys. In summary, their work offers a detailed understanding of the non-religious in Canada, the only comparative work on Canada and the US on this issue at this point, a methodologically sophisticated and comprehensive approach, a careful consideration of a range of theoretical possibilities, and paths for future research. So what's wrong with it? I have a few comments that are really things that are currently on my mind that I'd like the authors to think about with us today. First, methodology. And I'd note that Peter and I have dressed in black t-shirts. This was not planned. And I'm wearing my new Methodology Queen t-shirt that someone has anonymously sent me in the mail. So Joel has written an excellent book called The Meaning of Sunday, and it was for that work that the 30 in-depth interviews were done. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with reanalyzing these with a non-religion lens, but I do worry that the interviews have a particular perspective given that they were conducted in Alberta. Now, for those of you who are not Canadian, you might think of us as one big lump of similar people, but they've shown a map today that gives you some idea that that's not exactly so. There really are quite significant differences between regions of the country. Some research that Paul Bramadette will publish from British Columbia will be, I think, significantly different in tone from what we see in the interviews from Alberta. There's a very strong rhetoric of freedom in Alberta that in many ways reflects an American ideology and emphasis. Freedom does not have the same purchase in Canada as it does in the US as a whole. So I would like to have seen a bit broader scope for the interviews in terms of geography, simply because of that worry. But the freedom theme brings me to a second comment, the recurring theme of individualism in the work. Now, Sarah and Joel are not the only scholars to emphasize individualism in relation to studies of religion, non-religion, and secularism. Indeed, the ghost of Robert Bella is very present in this work. In fact, Bill Stahl, who's here today, was one of Bella's students. I'd like to invite us all, though, to take a deep breath and pause and drill down into this notion. I think it's tossed out all too frequently without careful reflection. Meredith McGuire's work on lived religion, and particularly her critique of Bella et al.'s interpretation of Sheila's spiritual practices, has to some extent taken up this challenge. But as we theorize about non-religion and current forms of religion, it might be worthwhile to think through claims about individualism and to develop a more robust articulation of its parameters. What is the work we're asking of the idea, or the idea of individualism, to do? What happens if we focus on what people do rather than what they say they believe? What are their everyday practices that connect them to others? What are the relationships that sustain them? What are new forms of community that we're completely ignoring in this conversation about individualism? There's a great deal of attention paid to what people don't do, but we don't get a sense of the richness of their lives or their relationships. In the book, for example, at page 171, we read about Darlene, and this is a quote: "By her own admission, she's best known for what she is not rather than for what she is." This is to be expected if she's non-religious. It's a bit like here come the cats. It's a bit like measuring the capacity of cats in relation to opposable thumbs. No, they can't unscrew a jar cover. That could be the end of the conversation. But my calico, Victoria, can leap 6 times her body length, for example. No, Darlene is not religious. But what is she? Here I'd mention the work of Tim Stacey, who is busy conducting research in British Columbia on the positive content theme. And I've heard a lot of that at this conference, and I find it quite exciting. I would also point out that the purveyors of individualism as a viable conceptual touchstone are somewhat invested in the project of framing religion as good. Again, thinking of Bella and his ideas of the good society, and of course, Charles Taylor, especially as it relates to communities. Enough said about that. Sarah and Joel and I have had a previous conversation about charitable giving and volunteering. The concern that decline in religious participation equals decline in charitable giving and volunteering. Sarah is able to marshal her considerable talent in relation to StatsCan data to answer this, but I'd like to put it on the table for those of you who have not heard them speak about this. The Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is partly framed as an exploration of the consequences of the rise of non-religion, both positive and negative. Brian Clark and Stuart McDonald raise worries about charitable giving and volunteering, and it's a particular concern of theirs in their excellent book, Leaving Christianity. But I wonder if much of the giving is actually to keep churches afloat. Yes, churches sometimes use this money to do good work that benefits us all, but they also use the money to sustain themselves as organizations. As for volunteering, are churched people particularly sensitized to framing their activities as volunteering? I would say that ultimately, I think Sarah, Joel, and I share the same concern. If there's a meaningful decline in charitable giving and volunteering because of the increased number of people who are unaffiliated with institutional religion, or as Clark and McDonald argue, that there's no socialization into giving and volunteering, how do we make up that deficit? And I think that's the core concern that the three of us share. There are places in the book where it seems that there are assumptions or value judgment. This is a new topic. Sorry, I didn't pause properly. There are places in the book where it seems that there are assumptions or value judgments being made that need to be articulated more explicitly. For example, on page 10, we read, "Within a more permissive Canadian cultural milieu, rather than stigmatizing religious non-identification, there is a sense among some that the stigma is reserved in part for those who are very religious." When I read that, I was a bit taken aback. What is a permissive Canadian cultural milieu? What exactly does that word mean? Similarly, on page 21, we read, "Despite finding themselves in a landscape where secular values and behaviors are normalized, this demographic still values the rewards attached to their faithful religious adherence and involvement." And further on that page, "Meanwhile, the rest of society moves more and more in a secular direction." What are secular values and behaviors? I'm curious about that. And that is at the beginning of the book, and it seems to come a bit from nowhere. As some of you know, I've tried to bracket the use of the word secular in my own work to see what happens. What am I forced to explain by not relying on it to fill meaning gaps? I think we need to bring the same critical attention to the notion of the secular as we do to the religious, asking questions about where it's used and for what purposes, who is constituting it, and in what ways. And of course, always questions about power relations. So, in a social world in which difference is exacerbated in the service of fueling social conflict, Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme demonstrate through their examination of beliefs about issues like the environment, social support for the poor and immigration, and social support for the poor and immigration, that there are similarities across the religion, non-religion divide that hold promise for living well together as a diverse society. They remain cautious about this possibility, and indeed they invoke my work on deep equality. Thank you again for that, using it with caution. Their work is an essential building block for the path toward the end, toward living well together. Thiessen and Wilkins-Laflamme are leaders in this field of research, both in Canada and internationally. None of the above is an important and significant contribution to scholarship on non-religion, religion, and social change. Thank you for doing this book. It's a great contribution to the field.
Thank you, Laurie. Yeah, wow, great comments. Gonna have so much to say. But before we get to that, Peter, over to you for your comments.
As my comments will be similar to Laurie's in that I approached the book from my own typical preoccupations. And some of the things that I would touch on will be overlap, but largely there's some other things I want to talk about, which is good because then the two critics aren't saying the same thing, which is great. It's been a while since I read this book from cover to cover as part of the COVID thing, right? Because I read last year sometime, then reread parts of it in order to prepare for these things. But I remember when I first read it, this was when the Non-Religion Complex Future Project was just getting going. And I said, oh, this is great. Sarah and Joel are collaborators on the project. We've just got our first deliverable. Because, I mean, it is so, yes, I know. As I said deliberately, because it isn't, right? It addresses some of these core questions that project is about, and that indeed this conference is about as well, in a very direct, very helpful way. It's a marvelously, shall we say, clearly structured and defended argument that is presented. We know what data you're using. We know how you're using it. The steps along the way, it's really kind of clear. There are no, as it were, significant gaps in, where did this come from? Or, that's interesting kind of stretching the data kind of interpretation. The book does very well from that, mostly with extant sources, but I noticed that one of the ones that you didn't mention is the PNSS, which the Pacific Northwest Social Survey, which appears in the Cascadia book as well. That's some new data as well. Now, the book is about, as the cover says, it's about the nuns, and so we're dealing with a category that, like so many of the categories that we actually use in the social sciences, that are created by our methods. Right? These are, it's like trails in a cloud chamber for the physicists, right? It's it's not the real thing, but it's something that we've created in order to talk about what it is that we're interested in. And so one has to be really aware, and the book is really aware, that nuns is an artificial category. I mean, all categories are artificial, but it's artificial in a particular kind of way. Since as the book cover, which I have here, right? Clearly, this is a very Canadian, by the way, because you've got you took it off the census, right? The top 6 positive religious identifications in Canada. There they are. If this were the United States, Sikhism wouldn't quite make it to make it there. So so the nuns are none of the above. That's what actually, but actually in the census and in many of this, it's the tick box, no religion. I know that. The reference point for the nuns is that institutional stuff. right? So, and that means that we're dealing with a very particular grouping of subjective grouping of people that we start out knowing obviously only what they aren't, or what they, you know, or what positive box they ticked. And so we have a problem that if we're talking about the people who are not religious or who eschew religion, then we've got this complex little category that may be contaminated with all sorts of things that we might not want in that category, but is anyway. And this is where Joel and Sarah solve this problem by introducing a very cogent typology between the let's see how it goes, the involved seculars, the inactive non-believers, the inactive believers, the SBNRs, and the religiously involved believers. One notes that all the category, that the extreme categories are positive: involved seculars and religiously involved believers. The other ones are defined by what they're not. All right, so we're in between here, including, of course, the SBNRs, because it's spiritual but not religious. And therefore we have this group that is delineated within itself in terms of kinds of things that it is not, or the way that it is not what it isn't, which is religious. And this then is used as a kind of a frame to discuss what is going on here. Now, this brings me to perhaps the main thing that I want to talk about this book that I really, really like, and that is that it treats its entire subject not as static categories, but as a dynamic process, which is why Stages of Decline is not only selected as not the only, but the principal analytic frame, but that the concept of secularization, which is also a processual term, of course, kind of floats in the background, right? It's mentioned often enough, but that's not one of the theoretical frames, but that's what all those things refer to, right? And therefore, this is a discussion about secularization. And then, of course, the concept of secularization, I don't have to go over the problematic aspect of that concept. And Laurie has already pointed out the degree to which this concept of secular is by now itself so contaminated that it's difficult to use with any kind of clarity. So these the conceptual theoretical frame concepts like stages of decline, spiritualization, individualization, and polarization, I think that they're a very excellent selection for being able to get at aspects of what's inside this contaminated category of the nuns. I would be inclined to actually defend the use of individualization and spiritualization because what they do, quite aside from everything else they do, is that they locate where it is that we have to look because we can't look in this other place anymore, right? Spiritual contrasts itself with religious. So spiritualization is a de-religionization in that sense. Individualization is the other side of, what should we call it, collectivization, institutionalization, right? The individualization is the locus of what people do, how they think, is now more in the individual and not in the institution. So there's that concept of individualization also has this kind of negativity about it. It's what it isn't, right? And here, I mean, I can refer again to, I mean, if you look at the lived religion literature, which Laurie mentioned as well, this is essentially what they do. They don't deny the institutional part. They say, let's look at the individual part, use the individual as the locus of structure and authenticity, and figure out what those people are doing in their later lives. And that's what we've been ignoring. And that's where the lived religion makes this assumption. That's where the real stuff is happening, right? Whereas that contains a negation conception, which says, well, it isn't actually happening in this other stuff anymore or exclusively. So it's a shift in frame that says, if we can't look for religion or its equivalent in the institutions anymore, then where are we going to look for it? And then the only really alternative is to get outside those, or, collectivities are one thing, but individualization is the other way of getting at it. What I want to say, it's a methodological, conceptual methodological step that is taken in order to be able to get at something that the old methods don't allow us to get at anymore. Now, I want to get back to the dynamics of the analysis, right? The stage of decline, the thesis is of course not new. It is, however, a very cogent analytic concept in this concept, because it focuses on the degree to which what we're looking at, the societies that we're looking at, they are, like modern society anyway, in constant transition. There is no stability. What was yesterday is not today, and then it's to figure out what the heck's happening, right? And then, as the book does at the beginning, well, where are we going? And of course, your answer is who knows? But here are some possibilities depending on, right? So that means that there is, the nuns, especially the central category. The central category is not static. It's not just a question of there are more of them with every generation, so to speak. It's also sometimes implicit, but more or less also explicit. What it means to be a nun is in the process of changing. And here I want to refer, I noticed this in your presentation of the book, where your graphs, I know this for methodological reasons, but the graphs started in 1985. And we know from this guy's Campbell, from Britain, I don't remember the 60s. I was there. And that's when this, the whole thing fell off the table in about 1965. And then from 1985, we got all these developments here, but that there's a pre-process, right? There's a pre-process to which the book implicitly refers, and sometimes explicitly refers, that kind of prepares the way for this analysis. Another way of putting it is that in the Canadian census in the 1960s, none was not a possibility, right? The 1961 census, I think, was the last one that was taken by hand. And there the instruction was, do not take none as an answer unless you can't, unless you actually have to. So, even the category of being a nun is being introduced during this time. So that whole dynamic is very much involved in how this presentation gets done, and why, I get back to why the use of the concept of secularization would not have been a good idea, because then you would have stuck with trying to defend the concept and not get at what you're really trying to get at here. Now, the other aspect that Laurie mentioned this one as well, and that's something that I was looking at for the case. We know you're telling us a lot about what they're not, but we want to know what they are, right? That's where the Non-Religion Complex Future Project definitely comes in. And there you have, actually, this is chapter 4, isn't it? Yes. What are the positive values? What are the positive stuff that isn't religion that nuns gravitate towards, shall we say, or exhibit in a higher percentage than other people, this kind of stuff. And there you get to what I call the dynamics and logic of inclusion, right? This idea of that a key value is to be more and more inclusive, right? Along the various categories of difference that we are that we are so used to doing, like sex, gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That there is this push towards inclusion that is as core of a value, in the sense that if you hold this value, it cannot be questioned, and to question it itself is a real problem, right? As much of a problem as some time ago saying that you're an atheist, right? You can't say that and not suffer negative consequences. We're living in an atmosphere where, especially where these nuns are concerned, where they gravitate towards that positive value and consider it to be absolutely central. And maybe individualization or individualism might be another one that gets put into there. And that is, I think, I think it's a decided contribution. I mean, you weren't the first to point this out, right? That among the nuns, this is a kind of trend, but it is the portion of the book that looks at what the nuns positively are, in addition or instead. I don't think it needs to be put quite exactly what that is. But there's this, the major social trends that we talk about, inclusion of diversity, of all identity categories, environmentalism. And the one that I sort of didn't quite get there, and this is one I would, I put my notes here, I put it as a question mark. What about post-nationalism, right? What I'm trying to get at with the word is kind of complex, but I'm reminded of some research I did a few years ago where I discovered that culture is on average more important to the religious people than it is to the non-religious people. Not just the same as with spirituality. Spirituality is more important to the to the religious, or at least as important to the religious as it is to the SBNRs. So there's another aspect of it, this kind of global inclusivism that goes along with some of these other categories. So, there we have some of the factors. What do these people do? What do they consider to be good? What do they consider to be evil and to be combated? How do they imagine that they were going to run their individual and their collective lives? And what is their collective life? That you don't get at so much, but Laurie mentioned that as well. That's the kind of question that I know that in the NCF project largely is one of the questions that we're definitely asking. And as I said, so there is this ideal and value of inclusion of difference, which, as we know in the Canadian context, we are in the strong process of institutionalizing progressively according to our three different silos, under recognition, integration, and reconciliation. Right? These are all drives toward in this similar kind of direction, and then the ideal of individual sanctity. Now, finally, this is about, you mentioned that you talk about this in the final chapter as well. This is Canada and the United States. What about the rest of the world? Well, as you say, I mean, in other parts of the world, this analysis couldn't even use the same concepts. It would be entirely different, for instance, in East and Southeast Asia. The way the concept of religion and religious nun works there is so different that it's a completely different starting point. And by the way, in terms of your future trends, what's going to hold up, we realize, of course, that, as Canada and the United States admit more East Asians, they're admitting a lot of people who are religious nuns, in counterbalancing all those people from other part of the world who are rarely religious nuns. Although that might be changing a bit. I don't know. I read some stats recently that the percentage of Canadian immigrants who are coming from China is declining relative to other parts of the world, where it used to be the major source. So there may be some different things going on there as well in the future. And of course, there are those many other parts of the world are, to use Berger's late phrase, as furiously religious as ever, where this is an entirely different dynamic, including especially as concerns your fifth chapter in terms of the polarization and the conflict between the two. So I did have some more to say about, the volunteering and giving. That's also one of my rather constant bugbears, in the sense of, yes, there is less volunteering happening, and non-religious people, even outside of religion, seem to give less. But as I look at the society around me, the services and care for all those people and causes that volunteering and giving supported and still support doesn't seem to be suffering all that much. And what's going on there? And that may be a subject for the positive aspect of religious nuns. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the book. It was a delight to read, and very inspiring for thinking about many of these questions
Thank you, Peter, for the comments. Okay, so Joel and I are going to take a few minutes to get into it, and then after that, we'll open it up to the floor to everyone. Okay, Joel, I'm throwing it to you as my prerogative chair. Do you want to start us off on your response?
It'd be my pleasure. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Laurie and Peter, just for your careful and attentive feedback, really warmly received. And I would say many of these things we're certainly on the same page. And I think some of these things are not that we're the first out of the gate on all of these things, but perhaps on some of these things and even how some of the conversations have evolved since then. And I would say we're very much pulling in the same direction as some of the comments that you drawn our attention to. Maybe there's ways we could have or should have been more subtle, nuanced, etc. on some of these things. But I'll say a few things and try to follow these in turn. In terms of interview location, absolutely, Laurie. I mean, as all of us know, in many respects, this project is drawing on available data and resources at the time, and it gets us kind of going on some of these things. But no doubt it would be invaluable to do interviews of this kind and other qualitative forms of data collection across the country, very much paying attention to the regionality that we draw upon within our analysis. And I think you're right, there would be some more nuanced things that would give us, I think, a deeper and broader assessment of the diversity among and between nuns within that. So full agreement there. The research needs to happen. Would love to be part of that, and collectively in this group, I think is just some great opportunities. The conversation on individualism is quite significant, and this, I think, gets in part at the core of both of what are nuns and what are they not. And we try to tease some of that out within the project. I think we are fully committed to this sense of we need to know more about what they are. I think we talk a little bit about some of Lois Lee's work and others of how that's a great opportunity and need moving forward. And I think in some part we're hampered by the available data at the time of writing this. I don't think we don't intend to, I should say, when we talk about individualism, to suggest that it's completely devoid of any kind of communal or social settings. I think even our framing of individualism and individual views on the world, of course, come in and through a social environment and context that shape how people view the world. I think where the gaps are, and if I hear you correctly, Laurie, in drawing our attention to, is there are all kinds of social spaces whereby religious nuns live and exist and think about the world and actually do things. Here I'm thinking of Nancy Ammerman's work, for example, in 2014 on sacred stories and spiritual tribes, one of the, I think, just great examples that everyone should read to look at how this happens in the workplace setting and in family settings and one's neighborhood and community. And I think more research would be incredibly valuable there. At the same time, and maybe this picks up on some of Peter's observations, if we're using, problematically so, in some respects, sort of that institutional framework for looking at where religion has existed for a significant period of time in terms of our frame of reference here, where does one look to find these places and spaces whereby people are thinking about identity, are practicing a variety of spiritual practices, where they're living and experiencing life with other people? I think there's a great opportunity to really lean into those things, to learn a lot more. That I would say our intention is not to create kind of a bifurcation between it's either individual or it's community. There's an element of both of those that come into play, and I think there is a dearth of a gap in research. Part of what this larger project that you're leading is trying to help us to get into those spaces and to learn that. At the same time, I would say that at least from the available data we had in this book, that not as much of the religious nun activity occurs in sort of formal communal settings in terms of an institutional space or place. So we talk about the 5 different types of nuns, and we talk about the involved non-believers. You think of atheist organizations or communities, you talk about like the Sunday Assembly, that contrary to what some might think, very few religious nuns are actually part of those kind of organized spaces. And thus the shared question for all of us is, okay, so where are folks gathering, and what is it that gathers them together? Is it and I'm hesitant to use this, right? Is it a non-religious context or framework that binds them together? Like atheists are drawn together, sort of the shared synergy of not believing in a God or supernatural being. So I think there's a lot of runway for sure to be made there. Assumptions and value judgments. Yeah, interesting. I think just in hearing you share some of those things back to us, Laurie, I think there's certainly some ways that we could have been sharper and more refined in presenting those things. I think sort of those perceptions or the stigma towards the religious you noted on page 10 there. I think there's certainly as a segment of research among more religious folks in Canada who talk about the perceived stigma. And I think that perception matters. That may not actually be the reality. And of course, this happens on both ends of the continuum. And that's part of our task sociologically, is to disentangle some of those things. When we talk about the prevailing secular culture or values or attitudes there, what we had in mind, and maybe this could be open to criticism here, is kind of that societal secularization framework, the disentanglement of religion and a series of other social institutions in terms of religion, law, politics, education. And at the same time, and I could probably already hear you saying, Laura, yes, but we know there's still a religious hegemonic framework that's built into the legal system and into education and so forth, and points well taken. And so this is part of the tension, is it's not what it once was. It's not fully secular, so to speak. There isn't a complete disentanglement between religious groups and these different social spheres. And so perhaps if I were to reframe, or if we were to rewrite those things, perhaps we might say that that the religious hegemonic powers and forces in these different social spaces are not what they once were, are not in some respects as powerful or prevailing or dominant as they once were, and yet they still are present in a series of ways, as you well know, and as this project is seeking to disentangle. So perhaps being just sharper and more refined in that respect would be pertinent. Maybe the last thing I'll say, and then I'll hand it over to Sarah, to Peter's question in terms of the rest of the world. And we pick up a little bit of this at the end in terms of future areas of research. And I think the theoretical framing that we provide in the project can be helpful for this, in thinking about the social environment and context for how religious nuns experience the world around, and then how they interact. So for example, if you're in a Muslim majority context, as a religious nun, and as an atheist in particular, who sort of has grown up in a Muslim family and then disavows that particular religious framing, that experience is dramatically different in some parts of the Middle East, for example, that we ought to give attention to, that would be quite different than, as we talk about in the United States. Yes, atheists confront a varying forms of stigma if they leave a highly devout religious family with family and friends and neighbors and coworkers. But I think it's a different context altogether in some of these international contexts. And that matters then for immigration. To what extent does non-religious persecution exists in other parts of the world that might contribute some to immigrate to Canada or the United States? And how does that contribute to an emerging diversity among religious nuns as well within a Canadian and American context? So yeah, some opening comments. Again, just really appreciate your engagement with our work. And yeah, we'll hand it over to Sarah to maybe fill in some gaps or build in on some of those.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Yes, and thank you, Laurie and Peter. This is what we write books for, right? So the painful process sometimes of writing a book is to have these wonderful conversations with our colleagues about a lot of these issues. And yeah, like Joel, I Joel and I tend to agree on a lot of things, and I agree with a lot of what Joel has said. So just to kind of push us further now. So yeah, like we're in like a transitional period in the subfield of non-religion and secularity studies, right? Like a lot of the work that's come before has been that more kind of negative, subtractive, what non-religious individuals are not. And we're now trying to move the field, many of us, including the NCF project and others, to kind of that more kind of positive or substantive content of, okay, well, what are they actually if they're not religious? And I think our book is kind of at that transition to a certain extent when we wrote it, right? So it's important, I think it was important to build in some important background there for Canada, because there hadn't been a whole lot of work done on the non-religious in Canada about, how big are they, if we define them in a couple of ways, if we build these typologies, what does it look like in Canada? And, how do they differ from the non-religious? And, like Peter was pointing out, slowly building in a little bit of more positive content. So, okay, if they don't have a religious worldview, what are their kind of morals and some of their ideas on kind of life's big questions, and what are some of their values and on issue positions, issue stances politically as well. And so the book is kind of it's almost like we were as we were writing, we were influenced by the work from the past, and kind of also slowly what's coming in the future with a lot of great work on substantive non-religion. I'm and I think Joel, we all have slightly different positions in how we want to focus on non-religion, and that's okay, right? Like, I'm not someone who believes there has to be one ultimate definition of non-religion and that's what we all use. I don't think that's viable. It's not what we see in, say, sociology of religion or religious studies that use different ways of conceptualizing religion, and that's okay. It depends what the study is, what the research question is. And so, we have different ways of approaching non-religion. In our case, it was kind of more pragmatic, empirical, that kind of those categories that, we sociologists all love to use. But I see your point that, there's other ways to approach it and that we should be pushing this further. And so, I'm someone who is interested in studying non-religion as it relates to religion, right? I'm a sociologist of religion. That's what's interesting me. And so, I want to see, how are they different? What's the dynamic there? What does a context where both groups and all their internal diversities have to coexist, and what does that look like? And so, I'm not sure how far I'm going to go into the positive, substantive side of non-religion. For me, that's like merging into other fields of sociology, like sociology of education, political sociology, which is all interesting. But, for my own personal research interest, I'm not sure how far I'll actually go. I'm happy to be on the NCF project and to see where that goes. But in my own research, I might still almost in that transition period of, okay, how do they relate to religion? Because outside of that, non-religion isn't really a thing, right? Like, it's, if you're away from religion, it's something else, and that something else is important to study. But it's at that kind of intersection where non-religious individuals have to interact with religion that I feel especially interests me. And so, I see the book as kind of that transition. And, as we read more, as we do more research, we'll kind of push that further, hopefully in the years to come. Okay, the charitable giving and volunteering question that Joel hasn't touched on yet. So this is an interesting one because, as I said earlier, Joel and I agree on almost everything, maybe sometimes too much. Like, sometimes it was just like almost too easy to write this book together, which it was an amazing experience to write together. But sometimes I felt like, we need a bit more pushback to kind of push that. But interestingly, on the question of charitable giving and volunteering, I think this is where maybe one of the rare occasions that Joel and I are actually a little bit different in our worries or thoughts about what it's going to look like moving forward. I'm actually not someone who's too worried about the fact that, yes, non-religious individuals, younger individuals as well, are less involved in your kind of classic charity giving, volunteering setup. Some of that service or civil society, I think non-religious individuals do not agree with where it's going. So, you can volunteer for a pro-life organization, which I think, a lot of non-religious individuals are that's not what they're into. And they actually see that as a bad outcome or something that they don't want to support. And so, I don't want to say that's all. There is some very important work going on in civil society that is especially being done by more engaged individuals in kind of more organized settings, including a lot of religious individuals. So I think some of that sector can kind of fall away, if you will, and it not have a huge impact on how, the younger generation lives its life and what they value. That being said, we'll see moving forward. I think, even though individuals, non-religious individuals are maybe less involved at that kind of organizational level, there are other things that they might be doing instead, right? And this is maybe like less looking at what they're not doing and more what they are doing. You know, that younger generation is much more likely to spend their money in certain ways that support certain things, right? Like Black companies, Black-owned companies, LGBTQ-owned companies. They do, you know, and this has been shown in a lot of surveys. I'm not saying they're perfect, like no one's perfect, right? A lot of people still shop on Amazon and shop at the bad places, but a lot are kind of more conscious now of where that money is being spent and how it's being spent. And arguably that has, in some instances, a much larger impact than, say, a charitable organization doing work in a small local area. Right. So I guess I'm less worried about the future here. I think, you know, there is going to be change. There's going to be some loss with that change. You know, there are some things that we are going to lose, and that's sad. But at the same time, I think there will be some things that we gain with the kind of new approach that non-religious or younger demographics are taking. And I don't see it as like the end of the world. I don't see it as crumbling. Whereas I think, you know, the literature that Joel's citing and the conversations that Joel has had with a lot of community leaders, there's much more of that worry there, right? Of like, where are we going with this? What's going to happen? And so, you know, we can keep talking about this in the discussion if individuals want. But, you know, it's important to highlight these differences. They are definitely there. There is, like, in the more organized religious setting, there are networks, there's social pressure, there's opportunities that drive individuals to give more of their money, resources, and time to certain causes that are less prevalent in the non-religious world. It's not saying they're absent, but they're less prevalent. And, you know, that is going to lead to certain changes in our society. And we'll see what happens there. And so I'm someone who's not that worried about it, but that is a reflection of my background, who's someone who's not that involved in that world as well. Okay, lots of great points. Yes, the stages of decline framework, Peter, is like a more nuanced, more kind of empirically focused version of secularization theory that takes a lot of what secularization theory is doing, but also nuancing some of its kind of maybe hardcore assumptions that are maybe less helpful. You know, like I'm always someone who doesn't believe in throwing out secularization theory completely. I feel like we lose the baby with the bathwater. I think something is going on here, and it's some of its aspects are worth keeping. But yeah, some of the assumptions like religion's going to completely disappear in our societies. No, religion stays around, but now it's one of many different forms of worldviews that we see in our societies. And so what does that look like, right? I'm interested in pushing that forward. But yeah, it's the stage of decline is focused on that kind of more individual secularization aspect of how does an individual going from being quite religious to maybe a generation or two later saying they have no religion and being quite removed from all forms of religion and spirituality. But I think we're trying to build complexity into that model to kind of better reflect the empirical data that we're seeing on the ground. Post-nationalism, that'll be my last point to touch on what you were asking about, Peter. So yes, so non-religious individuals don't care about cultural symbols that are, you know, let's face it, tied to religious traditions of a certain kind, right? So yeah, like if they keep threatening to take the big cross down on Mont Royal in Montreal, people who throw their arms up in protests are usually the kind of more cultural Catholics of Quebec rather than your kind of younger non-religious populations. That being said, this is again how you define culture. Other aspects of Canadian culture, say like the emphasis on diversity, I think if you were to criticize, like you mentioned earlier, you criticize the idea of inclusivity, of diversity, those values, the non-religious will really push back. They don't want to criticize those. They have a lot of support for that. And so is that, I see that as another form of nationalism, right? So nationalism, the symbols have changed, maybe some of the content has changed, but it's still nationalism, right? It's still, you know, we still use that as these are our values and to kind of differentiate ourselves from other countries, you know, often sometimes the US, but also elsewhere in the world. And it's also, you know, we have to integrate immigrants into our values, the English language being one, and those kind of diversity and inclusion being big Canadian national values still today. And so it depends, you know, like I don't see that as post-nationalism. I see that just as, you know, the content of culture is changing and is different in some respects, not in all respects, but in some respects for this kind of non-religious younger demographic. But I wouldn't call it post-nationalism. Like it's still a way to distinguish Canadian English-speaking identity. And I guess as someone on the border of like kind of French-speaking Canadian, I see it more in that light because I see a quite different identity and values in Quebec, for example, and in other parts of the world as well. What national symbols are we highlighting? I wouldn't say we've moved beyond that. You know, like to conceive a society where we move beyond that, where we're still using the nation state model of governance, I don't think wouldn't really call that post-nationalism. But this is just my thoughts on it, and we can open it up for discussion. Okay, so with that, Laurie, Peter, you're welcome to respond to our responses, but we'll also open it up. So if anyone wants to ask a question, make a comment, push this discussion further, please do. And Hannah, do you want to go first?
Sure. Super exciting research, and my brain is just going in all of these different directions. I'm really curious if you could maybe shed a bit more light on this. What you highlighted in your presentation is this kind of antagonistic relationship between nuns and what they would see as exclusionary religious communities, perhaps evangelicalism, mostly Christian. And I'm just trying to understand why, basically. Is it a question of maybe if people grew up in that environment, maybe it's a sort of trauma response, or is there another question maybe around power, hegemony, maybe differences in values? Just more around that would be really amazing. Thank you.
Joel, do you want to start?
Thanks, Hannah. It's probably all of the above and then some. And I would say it's probably one of these areas where we need more research, and it's probably one that I'm probably most interested in of the different topics we looked at within this project coming out of it. But yeah, I would say for some, these are folks who have grown up in some of these more conservative religious groups, so it's a reaction against. Some of it's the ways in which media frames more conservative religious groups, not just within Christianity, outside of Christianity as well. I think some of that's in play. I think some of these things are fostered from religious nuns who are raised by religious nuns, and we talk about that in terms of those who are socialized within the home to have a particular view towards more conservative groups. And then when we're talking about more conservative groups, I think it pertains to moral and ethical stances, things on gender, sexuality, even views on authority within society or over the body. So there's a whole series of things there. And really what we're trying to articulate is these are people's perceptions. And what's interesting, when we talk about the positive perceptions towards groups that they believe to be more inclusive, like Buddhism, when we talk about some of even the gendered variations within Buddhism that very much map onto what you would find in more conservative groups of evangelicals, Muslims, and so forth, and yet the perceptions are quite different. So how and where and why are those perceptions formed as they are through these different social spaces? Yeah, I'll stop.
Yeah, and just to add to that, these perceptions, are important because, Joel says this all the time, is that they have real consequences, right? So, I always laugh at everyone loves the Buddhists, which I find interesting. And then, a lot of individuals talk about, the Buddhists are so inclusive. It's such a spiritual form. And, a lot of these values that we have in our Western societies come out the individual, you have choice, you have freedom within the movement. And then I'll raise something like, but there's Buddhist monk traditions who don't allow women to become monks, or there are instances of violence within the Buddhist tradition. And that seems to always kind of be put aside, like either individuals don't know about that, or that's not part of the perception they have of the tradition, right? And so it's like Joel says, it's not necessarily what reflecting a reality in these traditions. In some instances it might be, but in a lot of instances it's not. It's just that kind of, how is that perception built? Where is it coming from? And the fact that, the non-religious you will identify certain groups as more exclusive and inclusive, and that's their kind of way, which is ironic because that's a way of excluding certain groups in itself, right? It's like a paradox. It's a way of being closed-minded in a way. But that is, so it's not, we don't see non-religious individuals as completely open-minded. They value open-mindedness, and they identify that with certain groups, but in so doing, they're creating an us versus them kind of narrative as well, right? So that's fascinating. We get a bit into it in the last kind of substantive chapter in the book, but there's so much more to be done there too. Yeah. All right, Christelle, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you for discussing the book and presenting your results from the book. I have two comments and a very small question. And my first comment will be on the cultural framework of concepts, like the concept of individualization and spiritualization. And in Germany, individualization seems to work really well, but spiritualization doesn't, and spirituality doesn't work when young people are questions, are you religious, spiritual, or so. So they would not label themselves as religious, but also not as spiritual. And we have a recent survey among young people in schools, and they found out among these young people that a majority, like 40%, said they are not religious at all and they don't care. And then we have a minority, like let's say 25%, who say they are religious and they are involved in institutions. And most of them have a migrant background, either evangelical or Muslim families. They come from Muslim families or evangelical families. And then we have also in the middle quite a big group who say, I'm not religious, but I'm believing. And then this is also a difficult category. And then if you go and interview these young people and ask them if they don't label themselves as religious, what they mean, and they are able to elaborate on this. And this comes to my second point. They can nicely explain what are their values and what they are believing in or going for, and what is important to them. And that is helping others, being faithful to each other, taking care of friends and family members, and so on. So they can talk what is really important for them. And so they define themselves, what is it what they are believing in. And especially also when they are volunteering, like let's say within religious organizations, they are not necessarily would say they are religious, but we find that compared to, let's say, people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, they are also not hostile against church or religion, because they have a quite nice experience. They participated in church weddings, and it is experienced as family events and so on. So, so that is why I ask, is this concept a cultural concept of spirituality, and it works much better in the US and in Canada? And the small question I would like to ask you is, if you show that a number of nuns are increasing, is it, or has it something to do with it that the people in the 60s and 70s are still baptized and they have to leave church, but they don't baptize their own children? So they are from the beginning on not socialized in religious socialization, and so they can it's more easy for them to be not religious.
Yes, thank you, Christelle. I'll start, and then Joel can jump in. Yeah, you've kind of just described that stages of decline process for that kind of how, we get to religious unaffiliation amongst a larger portion of the population, right? It doesn't usually happen overnight. You don't tend to go from being like super involved with a religious group to like being completely removed from it, and in identity and belief as well as in behavior. It usually takes, a certain amount of time and a certain amount of generations to reach that, usually about 3 generations in the context of Canada and the US, to get like that kind of larger chunk of the nuns in the population. And so, how long that trend will keep going, I don't think it's going to take over all of society either, right? You're still going to have a more kind of religious demographic. You're going to still have people in the middle too, who are kind of that fuzzy or cultural ties to religion that remain, but those groups are becoming smaller. And so that's kind of what the coexistence looks like. And thank you for pointing out that, yeah, even within Western societies, there are like important differences, right? Like you mentioned, the German context in some ways is very different, and also between Eastern and Western Germany as well. I'll share a slide here. I always have a few slides in reserve, just in case there's a question like yours, Christelle. And so this is that typology that Peter was referring to earlier on, that we used, that I got from the Pacific Northwest social survey that I ran with Paul Bramadat out west in 2017. So this is only British Columbia, right? So this is one specific region, but it gives an idea of the kind of diversity within those who say they have no religious affiliation, how it also compares to those who are religiously affiliated, and, you know, our different categories of the nuns. Now, you know, all typologies have their limits, right? There's fluidity between these categories, where we draw the line between categories sometimes just has to do with data more than anything else. But it kind of gives us a sense of how big these different kinds of nun groups are, right? I have completely on the left side here, the involved sectlars. So those are unaffiliated individuals who are quite active with non-religious organizations, who take part in non-religious organizations, and they're very low, right? They represent a small, you know, important minority that's had a lot of visibility in the existing literature, but that practically across a population of unaffiliated, it doesn't represent a whole lot of them. Much larger are those kind of inactive non-believer or inactive believers. So inactive non-believers, so not involved with non-religious organizations, inactive believers not involved with religious organizations. You know, they're those groups of nuns are much larger. And you have that spiritual but not religious group, so who identifies not as religious but spiritual and takes part, will define some of their activities as spiritual. You know, it's definitely there, but it's not your largest group of nuns as well. And then you have the kind of on the other end, say, like, there's always a small number of people who say they're religiously unaffiliated, but who are actually kind of the more evangelical brand, who just don't identify with one specific denomination, but are quite involved, usually with different evangelical groups. But that's also a very small portion of the nuns as well. And so, you know, I know that in qualitative studies, you tend to get individuals in qualitative studies, you interview individuals who are engaged and who are quite articulate, right? So often university educated, just as a product of sampling. And so they are the ones who tend to articulate their values best, who are able to speak about them, who seem quite driven. And, you know, because they're driven, they're more willing to like talk about it in an interview. But, you know, that's one of the advantages of having a mixed methods approach is, yes, those individuals are there. It's important to understand what those values are, like you were talking about, Christelle. But there's also, with the quantitative data, you can also see that there's actually large groups that are maybe more indifferent towards spirituality and religion, yes, but also maybe they're not able to articulate those values quite as well. Maybe they are less engaged or find them less important in their lives and are into other things. And so I think that's also important to keep in mind. A lot of the qualitative studies tend to highlight individuals who are quite engaged and who are quite articulate, are able to speak on these issues because they've had a certain level of education and they've thought about them a lot. There's a lot of individuals out there who don't, and we tend to, it's hard even to get them to fill out surveys. So sometimes we miss them in the quant data, but we often especially miss them in the qualitative data. So it's important to keep that in mind. Just something I wanted to mention there. Joel, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, nothing to add. That was comprehensive.
Okay.
Thanks, thanks, Christelle.
Oh, and just yeah, and Christelle, just back to the rise of the nuns. Yeah, you are now getting a larger proportion of the unaffiliated who have no religious socialization, right? Like I come from a background like that. It wasn't even in the realm of possibility. And so, yeah, there's still disaffiliates, but there's more and more of those cradle nuns. And those cradle nuns who are like born non-religious look a lot different on certain things. Like they're not that engaged with non-religious organizations because they don't care, right? They're totally engaged somewhere else. And so it's individuals who have less of that kind of clash with religion in their lives. They didn't have to necessarily disaffiliate from it. They don't necessarily have negative experiences there. They look quite different. They're the ones that are like harder to find sometimes in our studies. And that maybe that's where the positive substantive non-religion becomes more of an interesting place to study there, especially with them, because they have like very few ties with religion, right? Okay, Peter, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. I mean, you got me thinking about something related to what happens in the book, but also quite different. We have these concepts that we use in this discussion, and they've been used here, that especially represented in spiritual but not religious, right? So that's a kind of a positive definition. I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, right? And then we have concepts like, you know, cultural Catholics, right? I'm not quite a Catholic, but I'm a cultural Catholic, right? So the two concepts overlap. Now it occurs to me, and I'm thinking for reasons complex that I can't explain, so forgive me for just jumping like this, Crystal. We do not have a positive concept for another kind of sort of religion that isn't quite religion. And that is, we don't have a positive concept for superstition. If you think about it, what counts as superstition? I mean, it varies across the world, right? Superstition sometimes is just anything that's not standard religion. But it's also, it's beliefs and related practices that don't quite count, right? They're not real, they're not serious, or so we need a positive concept. A couple of things that I'm thinking about in the European context, to some degree in the German one as well. For instance, the popularity of alternative medicine in Germany is quite high, as far as I know. I mean, you can go to absolutely any drugstore, apotheke, and you can find a whole wall of homeopathic medicines, right? They're quite popular. Also in Europe, people have a much bigger problem with GMOs than comparatively in North America. And research has also shown that they have more problem with GMOs when animal and plant genes are combined than they have when two closely related plant genes are combined. So there's, you might say, there are definite beliefs there. There are definite kind of world orientations there. And in our discussion, I don't know that we have a set of concepts for including that sort of stuff, other than, sometimes these things are called superstition or just illusion or whatever, right? So we have negative concepts for it, but I think perhaps we can work toward developing positive ones, because then there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can include in the conversation for which we have no terms yet.
Interesting, Peter. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, like I'm always interested in what impacts other aspects of social life. So like voting, civic engagement. And so like I'm always less interested in those things because they haven't been shown to have a huge impact on like affecting your behavior towards, who you vote for or how engaged you are. But yeah, like if you are interested in kind of mapping what's going on, like all of these different dynamics, it definitely becomes important. And yeah, there are definitely holes there, right? Yeah. Go for it, Bill.
Just to follow up on the discussion we've just been having, to what extent do you look at social class as a variable in amongst the religious nuns? As you mentioned, there seems to be an over-selection for the professional managerial class because they tend to be articulate. But how much have you looked at social class throughout your study?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'll start and then Joel can jump in. It's not a main thread in our study. We look at some demographic differences, obviously, between the non-religious and the religious, but it's not something we focus hugely on. Social class is usually a composite indicator, right? It's got, your occupation, your level of education, usually your income are like your three big variables that are involved there. And of those three, I always find level of education being the especially important one when it comes to differences between more religious and less religious populations in the Canadian and US context. Income plays a little bit of a difference. Occupation plays, is tied to income and level of education, obviously, and so it's there. But level of education, I find, seems to be the more kind of impactful variable. So that's usually what we focus on, or I focus on in my work as the kind of more meaningful variable there. But that being said, there's a growing number of studies now showing that in places where there's larger proportions of the population that are non-religious, those demographic distinctions between the religious and non-religious seem to decline in size, right? So the difference, the fact that men tend to be more unaffiliated than women, those with a university education tend to be more unaffiliated than women, white populations tend to be more unaffiliated than racial minorities. Those differences are especially present when there's like that kind of first transition towards non-religion amongst a smaller portion of the population. In British Columbia, for example, a lot of those differences, there still is the kind of racial difference that I think is definitely worth focusing on, that we don't maybe focus on enough in this book, and that, future studies should really focus on. That's still present, but the kind of the differences in level of education, in gender, they all kind of shrink and as it becomes more normalized to say you have no religion, right? So yeah, we don't focus on social class a whole lot, and that there is a bit of a conscious decision there, because it's, for us, it's not a main variable at play. It's always part of the mix, and there is some interesting stuff to do there, but it's not what we focus on in the book so much.
In the opening chapter, we do provide a bit of a comparison that looks at education both in Canada and the US, the religiously affiliated and unaffiliated, and you find that they're virtually identical in both nations when it comes to education there. So sorry, over to you, Anna.
Oh, yeah, go for it, Anna.
Thanks, and I really enjoyed this whole discussion and the book as well, really helpful for kind of thinking about some work I've been doing with non-religious children and parents in the UK. I just wanted to kind of briefly kind of comment on Hannah's question and kind of Laurie's point about individualism, and kind of connect them actually, and kind of comment that with the children and parents we've been working with in the UK, some of the parents especially, not so much actually the children, express this kind of similar sense of unease with religions that they see as more conservative. And I would kind of see that as a particular ethical stance, that they're kind of uneasy with religions, and this would be particularly evangelicalism actually, that they see as kind of transgressing an ethic of equality and the sort of freedom to let the other be. And the parents and children kind of similarly express often a sort of sense of religion as a matter of the individual, and that it's about individual choice, but at the same time they talk about how, you know, it's wrong to discriminate against people on grounds of religion and belief, and it's about a kind of ethic of allowing the other to be, as long as the other's being doesn't impinge on others' right to be. So kind of I would see that as kind of fundamentally an ethical stance. But I think Laurie's kind of comment about kind of then looking at how that's enacted in practice and kind of looking at how they live those values in their relationships with others is really helpful. So the children and parents we work with, you know, they might express this sort of sense of, you know, about the importance of the individual, but then actually living that out. They express forms of care for their local community, the environment, schools, etc. So yeah, I've just found the conversation really, really kind of helpful in terms of sort of articulating those different aspects.
Joel, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And just, I mean, complete affirmation for these kinds of observations and the kinds of things that I just need more work, like the stuff that you and Rachel are doing, that lived religion, non-religion, ethnographic type of research that helps us to tap into those things. And so it's great to see different folks doing that in the NCF project. And I think more will help us to both clarify the relationship between the individual and the group on these different things, and nuance that as well. So yeah, very, very good.
All right, Christelle, you want to have the last question or comment before we head out?
Yeah, I would like to reply to Peter's suggestion. I'm not really convinced of this category of superstition. You know, that Lev Pollack uses it since years in his surveys and in his work, and he asked about believing in astrology or alternative medicine, and he comes to the conclusion that it's always a very small proportion of people, like among or not more than 5%, and it's staying low since the 80s. It's not an increasing category, and he uses as an indicator for religious individualization. But I'm really not convinced of this type of categories. In a questionnaire, it would be maybe different if we have a different design and look at the religious field, and then we see that from this alternative medicine and religious realms, they are entering the religious field. But in surveys, I'm not convinced that you really get much out of such categories.
Yeah, the groups who take part in some of these superstition or alternative medicines, they do remain, you know, it's not everyone, but it's definitely there. Yeah, when you like these, always the distinction, right, between what you actually end up measuring on the ground and the concepts that we as researchers build from that, right? Like you don't ask the concept to the individual because usually that the concept makes no sense to the individual. Spiritual is like that one that's on the borderline, right? Like spiritual, like often when I'll run a survey, I have to define spiritual because, you know, it could mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And, you know, so if in a qualitative study, maybe you want to capture some of that variation, but in a survey, that variation can cause problems, right? Because individuals aren't referring necessarily to the same thing that you might be thinking of when you're asking those questions. But this is actually something that like Peter and the group, the migration group with the NCF, and Peter, you can speak to it a bit, has been doing in that survey you spoke about on Wednesday, Peter, like discussing, you know, how do we ask these new questions? What do they look like? How do we do it in a way that everyday person can understand what it is we want to know? And, you know, how useful can it be for actual findings and results, right? Peter, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's in response to Crystal. I mean, Crystal, you're absolutely right. I mean, I know Detlef's work on this. It's really that we have to develop a better sense of what belongs in that category, right? We have the standard ones that we always ask, like astrology, alternative medicine, stuff like that. I actually chose to put the GMO thing in there because that's a little bit more of something that people would never consider to be religious, right? Who hold these views, and it's sort of is an area that the problem is that we've got a lot of development to do to be able to get conceptual hold of what is going on out there. I mentioned the concept of superstition because it historically gets at a lot of stuff that is kind of penumbral, and therefore that may be a place to look, but we can't look at it in terms of simply in terms of its traditional markers. But I can't tell you at the moment what the additional markers are going to be. But as Sarah said, we are trying to do this in this survey, for which we, by the way, yesterday finally got ethics approval.
Hey.
Yes. So we'll see if we get anything out of that, right? I'm not making any promises, but and I know that we're not the only ones trying. On we go.
Wow, it's a great way to end the session, Peter. We're out of time, so we have to leave it there. But thanks to all of you who came, who shared in the discussion, who shared in the chat as well. It was great to see many of you new and well-known faces. I never know how to end these virtual sessions, but thank you for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful end of conference today.
Thanks everyone.